Have you ever stopped and wondered whether some ancient myths were never myths at all? I mean, what if a story told around a fire thousands of years ago wasn't just imagination, or symbolism, or religion? What if it was memory? What if human beings were passing down real, eyewitness accounts so old they reach back before writing, before cities, before the pyramids, and we're only now realizing those stories were describing actual events? Because that's the wild part. In a few cases, science seems to show that some ancient oral traditions really do preserve memories of things that happened more than 10 years ago. And if that sounds impossible, stay with me. Because once you hear the evidence, this stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like one of the most mind-blowing things in human history. So today, we're diving into the ancient stories that may actually be true. Not in the sense that every supernatural detail literally happened, but in the sense that the asterisk core event asterisk behind the story appears to match real geological history. And honestly, that might be even more impressive. Let's start with the big idea here, because this is what makes the whole topic so fascinating. Most people assume oral stories can't stay accurate for very long. A few generations, maybe. A couple hundred years if you're lucky. But researchers looking at some indigenous traditions, especially in Australia, have argued that, under the right conditions, oral knowledge may survive for more than 7,000 years, and perhaps even close to 10,000. That doesn't mean every old legend is secretly a history book. It means that in some cultures, where storytelling is highly structured, socially protected, and tied to law, place, and identity, stories can preserve real information for astonishing lengths of time. Now, the most powerful example comes from Australia, and honestly, it's incredible. Across different parts of the Australian coast, Aboriginal communities have preserved stories about a time when the sea was lower, when places that are now underwater used to be dry land, and when people could walk to areas that are now islands. Think about that for a second. These stories describe coastlines that no longer exist. In one tradition from the Wellesley Islands, the story says the islands were once part of the mainland before the sea came in and cut them off. In other traditions, people remembered hunting on lands that are now submerged, or describe specific areas that used to be marshy country and freshwater lagoons before the ocean flooded them. Researchers comparing these stories with known post-Ice Age sea level rise argue that many of them may preserve memories from at least those seen to 16 years ago, and some interpretations push even older. And this is where it gets even crazier. These aren't just vague flood myths like, once there was water everywhere. The details matter. Some stories specifically describe islands once being attached to the mainland. Some refer to places now beneath the sea. Some even align with reconstructed ancient shorelines. That's why researchers take them seriously. It's not just that they mention water, it's that they describe asterisk particular changes in particular places asterisk. Exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from long-preserved memory rooted in landscape. A great example is from the Cairns region, where a story, collected from the Yidinji people, recalls a time when Fitzroy Island was part of the mainland and Green Island was much larger than it is today. The story also refers to landmarks now underwater. A conservative reading of that tradition could place its origin around 81 years ago, though scholars are careful to present that as an interpretation rather than absolute proof. Even the more cautious conclusion is still stunning. These traditions may preserve real memories from deep prehistory. And that brings us to an important point. When people hear the phrase, "these stories are true," they sometimes imagine scientists saying every detail is literally factual. That's not really the claim. The better way to say it is this. The supernatural frame may belong to the culture's sacred storytelling, but the event underneath it may still be real. A spirit can appear in the story, and the flood can still have happened. A god can throw fire from a mountain, and the volcano can still have erupted. That's how you should think about this topic. Which brings us to one of the most famous examples in North America. The story of Crater Lake. Today, Crater Lake in Oregon is one of the most beautiful lakes in the world. But according to Klamath tradition, there was a time before the lake existed, when a great mountain stood there instead. In the story, supernatural beings battle. The earth shakes. Fire and rock are hurled. Darkness spreads. And the mountain collapses. Later, the deep blue lake fills the destroyed place. Now here's the part that makes historians and geologists stop and stare. Geologists say Crater Lake was formed when Mount Mazama erupted catastrophically about 10,7 years ago. During that eruption, a huge column of ash and pumice blasted into the sky. Massive pyroclastic flows raced down the mountain. And then the volcano collapsed in on itself, forming the caldera that later became Crater Lake. The National Park Service explicitly notes that oral traditions of the Klamath tribes and Umpqua people indicate that people witnessed the eruption of Mount Mazama 10,7 years ago. Archaeological evidence also shows people were in the region at that time. So again, nobody's saying this story is a modern geological report in disguise. What they're saying is that the core memory, a towering mountain destroyed in a terrifying eruption, and collapse lines up remarkably well with what the Earth itself says happened there. And just think about the human side of that. Imagine watching a mountain explode. Imagine ash darkening the sky, fire coming from the Earth, the landscape permanently altered. That kind of event doesn't just disappear from cultural memory. It becomes a warning, a sacred place, a story you repeat because forgetting it would mean losing part of who you are. That, to me, is one of the biggest lessons in this whole topic. Oral tradition is not primitive writing. It's its own technology, a different system for preserving truth, one that doesn't rely on paper but on repetition, ceremony, responsibility, and memory. And once you start seeing that, ancient stories stop looking like childish fairy tales and start looking more like compressed knowledge. They may be symbolic, yes. Sacred, yes. Poetic, absolutely. But also, sometimes, historical. There's another reason this matters. For a long time, modern scholarship tended to assume that if a story wasn't written down, it was automatically unreliable. But these examples suggest that assumption was too simple. In some societies, especially where stories are tied closely to land, kinship, and law, accuracy can be protected across vast stretches of time. Researchers studying Australian traditions point out that the consistency of flood, stories across distant regions, all describing seas rising over once dry land, and not the reverse, makes them hard to dismiss as random invention. And to be clear, there's still caution here. Scholars don't claim that every old story can be dated neatly, or that every resemblance between a myth and a geological event proves a direct memory. Some traditions are clearer than others. Some may have changed over time. Some may blend real events with symbolic, meaning so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. Even researchers who are enthusiastic about these connections stress that certainty has limits. But honestly, that caution makes the whole thing more compelling, not less. Because even with that caution, the evidence is still strong enough in certain cases to say, yes, this story probably preserves something real. Yes, people may have carried memory across hundreds of generations. Yes, the ancient world may still be speaking to us if we're willing to listen. And maybe that's the real twist in this story. We'd like to imagine that the past is silent unless it's carved in stone or written in ink. But that's not true. Sometimes the past survives in a voice, in a chant, in a place name, in a story repeated so carefully that it outlives empires. A coastline vanishes beneath the sea, and the story remains. A mountain explodes, collapses, and becomes a lake, and the story remains. 7,000 years pass, and the story remains. So the next time someone says, "It's just a myth," maybe the better question is, just a myth to whom? Because for the people who carry these traditions, those stories weren't disposable entertainment. They were memory, identity, survival, a map of the world, and a record of what the world had done. And in some astonishing cases, science is finally catching up to what those stories were saying all along.